Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity. Although it's in the title, I think of the panel as sort of content warning that the material in this, as always when we speak about sexual violence, is very disturbing. I am aware of that, and I try to present it in a way that's respectful to the testimonies that I use. So let me just say a couple of words before I begin. What I'm talking about today is actually part of a project which is focused on writing, or in a sense rewriting, some episodes of World War II and Holocaust history using women's experiences and voices as the key standpoint. The larger project has 4 parts, actually 4 chapters. One is on Latvian and Jewish women volunteers in the Latvian divisions of the Red Army, something I've written a couple of articles on already. The experiences of Jewish girls and women in the ghettos of Latvia and Lithuania. The last year of the war in Latvia focused on women's experiences during the retreat of the German army and the return of the Soviet army. And what I'll be focusing on today, Jewish women survivors' experiences of liberation from camps and death marches. So my project has a few key questions. These are big questions, so I won't answer all of them in detail, but I will at least briefly address all of them. One is, what does history look like when constructed through the perspectives and experiences of women? Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that women are not present in history. I'm certainly not saying that there are no women historians, because there are lots of them right here. What I am saying is that historically, it's been the case that male historians, political leaders and propagandists, military leaders have produced dominant narratives of history based on the male subject. What I'm asking is, what do some particular episodes of history look like when they're produced using women's perspectives and when they center the female subject? I suggest that this is interesting because it both expands but also disrupts dominant narratives of history. The other questions are there in front of you. I'll get to those questions a little bit later. What are the challenges of using women's testimonies? And why are women's perspectives and the centering of women as the subject important in constructing histories of the Holocaust and World War II? So I begin with the first of the 3 questions in the sense that when we're asking what does history look like when constructed through the perspectives and experiences of women, I'm going to ask the question, and I'll just use as my brief case study here. What does liberation history look like when constructed through the eyes of women? Now, let me be very clear here as well. Liberation is a signal moment. It's the end of a mortal threat. It's the end of the genocidal savagery of Nazi camps and ghettos. But the story doesn't end there, and the story is more complicated than that. Survivor stories of violence at liberation by their liberators, in this case I focus on death marches and camps in the East, so we're talking about Soviet liberators, are revealed almost exclusively in sources that include testimonies, memoirs, sometimes letters. Each story is unique to its teller, but together they show patterns of survivor experiences, and they show sexual violence in its sociological context. Women's stories make for a more nuanced, albeit less smooth, and somewhat less redemptive narrative of liberation. As I indicated to you before, these quotes are relatively long. You don't need to speed read them. I've put most of the quotes that I'm using here on the sheets in front of you if you want to take a look at them. I've highlighted in red the sort of most important pieces of this. Although unquantifiable, women's stories of brutalization by their liberators are broadly present in sources. I should note that I didn't go looking for this topic. In a sense, this topic found me. As I indicated before, one of my other chapters is on girls and women's experiences in the Baltic ghettos. So I was following testimonies in the Fortunov collection, in USC Shoah, and a number of other sources, and when I would listen to the end, especially I was focused quite a bit on Stutthof camp, and then getting to the experiences in Stutthof and liberation from them, this was something that I started to notice, and I started looking for published sources on this, and there really wasn't very much, certainly not in English, not in other languages that I read, like Latvian or Russian, and I became interested in it, and it became apparent to me that this story is kind of underrepresented in the sense that, especially the way Americans like to tell history, that there's kind of an ending. There's a beginning point and an end point. And liberation, in a sense, represents the end point. But for many of the survivors, of course, liberation is no end point. And in fact, unfortunately, after years of trauma, the trauma for some continues. So let me talk about this in a little bit of a sociological perspective. When I was looking for patterns, or when patterns emerged from the materials that I was looking at, I didn't look for specific patterns. I waited for them to emerge from what I was reading. Two of these sort of narrative themes that appeared was that sexual violence was underpinned by Soviet liberators' sense of entitlement to women's bodies that was based on deeds, and that was based on, I'll say needs, but let me say perceived needs. So the difference between these is that the former is explicit while the latter is interpreted. So we can see in these particular quotations, I freed you and you are mine, I can do anything I want with you, the expectation of the extraction of some sort of debt to be paid. Okay? And this is something that I also encountered in a couple of testimonies that I found from Soviet female POWs who were also brutalized by their fellow soldiers. Right? The idea that they fought for us, so they had a right to do that. So deeds as one theme. A theme that emerges quite often is one that's not explicit, but rather is interpreted. It's interpreted by the survivor telling her story. I don't know how long they didn't see women, or whatever. They hadn't seen a woman in years. This is actually fairly common, more common than the previous one, in fact. Right? The idea that this was happening because there was a need for women that had not been met for years. This is an interpretation, though. This is not what the survivor is hearing someone say or remembering them say. This is what they're interpreting of the situation. So there's a difference between the deeds and needs stories. This is also, by the way, repeated occasionally by authorities. There wasn't really much of anything that one could call an intervention in this by Soviet authorities. It was sometimes justified with this idea, well, the soldiers hadn't seen women in years. So this sort of interpretation comes from a number of different locations. I want to share that one of the most common themes, and one that I was actually somewhat surprised by, is the theme of survival as evidence of complicity. An important dimension of these narratives of violence at liberation is this very theme. And I would argue that exposure to relentless Soviet propaganda impressed on soldiers, Soviet soldiers, the certainty of death at the hands of the fascist aggressor. Now, for too many millions, this was absolutely true, and survival was an anomaly. But this also made it, from that perspective, suspect. So the question became, how did you survive? Why did you survive? Which is, in fact, a question that emerges in filtration points when those survivors who are trying to return to Soviet territories are being filtered and they're asked, how did you survive? Why did you survive? What did you do? And for women, the assumption here was very often sexual complicity. You could live with the Germans, but you don't want to live with us. Now, it didn't matter that this wasn't true in almost every case. This was simply the assumption, and it's an assumption that's specific in this case to women, although there's a larger assumption of survival as complicity that also exists. Right? Women are told they're left alive because they're living with Germans. This appears, and I have a couple of quotes here, but this is a very common theme. I throw this in. This particular one from Fania Pavlova does not include sexual violence, but I think this is sort of indicative of what the kind of narration that was present in the filtration checkpoints also was, the sort of suspicion. Again, how did you survive, right? Why I wasn't, they asked me everything, how I survived, why I wasn't shot, because so many Jews had been. They couldn't fathom that I, a Jewish girl, stayed alive after all those concentration camps, right? This becomes a source of suspicion. The story of liberation is a story of, on the one hand, triumph and survival. That's true. It's also a story of trauma and victimization, again. But it's also really importantly a story about women helping women, which is a theme that emerges much more often than men helping women. And again, women take risks, make sacrifices, and act to protect family, friends, sometimes strangers. Women survivors were industrious, creative, strategic. There was a known threat, and women shared information, devised strategies to protect themselves, devised strategies to protect others. You see a couple of different stories here. One, Thea A., who's talking about her own experiences, Betty D., who's talking about women sort of working together to try to avert, right, the threat of sexual violence. This is an interesting one, this Eglitis item. She talks about how the women in her barrack, and I have to apologize, I don't remember which camp this was associated with, but it's possible to look up any of these. They all have the reference numbers on them. She talks about how she and the women in her barrack barricaded the doors, and using pencils and paper they found in an SS abandoned office on the camp, wrote typhoid fever and secured signs to their doors to scare away the soldiers. Now, numerous testimonies actually reveal a theme of post-war fears and realities of disease, and some women in multiple of these testimonies claim illness to deter attackers. In other cases, women actually were ill with typhus and other diseases. This didn't always deter their attackers, unfortunately. At filtration checkpoints, I've seen reports, I haven't really confirmed this, but I've seen information that suggests that at filtration checkpoints, so returning to the Soviet Union, there were also health clinics, and that these clinics treated many women survivors for sexually transmitted infections. I do not have good corroboration for that. I'm sort of looking for it, but it's something that I've encountered. If you have this corroboration, please share it with me. So important to raise here, I think, in a sense, is the theme of heroism. And I don't want to oversell heroism, because survival in a genocide itself is, in a sense, a heroic act. But at the same time, we see here over and over, right, stories not just of victimization, but stories of risk and courage and industriousness and bravery. And I think our kind of cultural norms have historically defined heroism, especially in war and times of conflict or genocide, as that which men do, which can be true, but it's also what women do. And I think that our traditional definition is kind of narrow. And I looked up in sort of a leading English language dictionary, the Merriam-Webster dictionary, what were synonyms and what were antonyms, so that's opposites of the word heroism or heroic. And for antonyms, which is opposites, I found weak, fearful, and unmanly. There were others, I'm not going to redo the whole list. Synonyms for heroic were a little more varied: valiant or gallant, noble, sometimes majestic, and an adjective that I actually didn't even know, even though I'm a native English speaker, which is manful. So if you know the word manful, then you're one step ahead of me. But it was striking to me that these particular terms were used in both being heroic and not being heroic. So what challenges do women's testimonies present? A number of them. I'll go through them very quickly. Any kind of stories of bodily humiliation, attempted degradation, or sexual violence are, of course, subject to social norms and stigmas. And historical, and I'll add contemporary societies and cultures shame victims rather than perpetrators. We can see this still in the Ukraine conflict today, where perpetrators will brag about sexual violence, and victims may or may not report what they've experienced. We can see the stigma in some of the, I'm going to hurry up a little bit so I don't miss all of my time. You have this on your sheet, but here we see victims themselves sort of acknowledging stigma. One of the things that's important here then is actually the frequency with which survivors are telling accounts of, well, this happened to the group that I was with, or this happened to my friends, and they kind of leave themselves out of it. They step away from it a little bit, and it's not really possible to tell if it's their story or if they're telling someone else's story or what their exact relationship with. And we have just the short item from Kathy Z. She says she was robbed and almost raped by some Russian soldiers. Right? So we often have this kind of, the thing I encounter often here is this happened to the group I was with, right? I saw this, but I hid. And so it's very difficult it's an unquantifiable phenomenon. It's unreported, it's not present in perpetrator documents. And it's sometimes unclear, although it is clear from the testimonies that some women who had survived the Holocaust and imprisonment did not survive this. So there are women telling other women's stories also. Reconstructing this story is really based, and I welcome your thoughts if you think differently about this, really based entirely on these sorts of documents, on testimonies, on some oral histories, some anecdotes, letters, written, published, and unpublished memoirs. There's nothing of this in official documents as far as I can find. I know there are some comments by the Soviet government, including Stalin, when it was reported to him that there were some mass rapes taking place, for example, in the Balkans. And there's some comments that have been made with respect to a much more frequently told story, which is the mass rapes of German women, for example, in Berlin at the end of the war. There's some comments on that, but in general, perpetrator documents don't really tell us much about this. I mean, liberation is a story of heroes from the Allied perspective, right? So it's not a story of heroes as villains. Many stories here are told years after the events, although I have found a few, for example, in Yad Vashem, there are a few written memoirs that come out before the Yale Fortuna for the USA Shoah interviews. Details, of course, may not be precise, but multiple testimonies can really function to confirm patterns of experience, if not the specifics of a particular experience. Why do these testimony-based histories matter? Well, they matter for a lot of reasons, but I would argue that dominant narratives of World War II and Holocaust history are incomplete without diverse standpoints. Right? The women's experiences matter. A full accounting of history requires the inclusion of a multitude of standpoints, and women's testimonies or memoirs tell stories and histories that might otherwise be left in the margins, that may or may not be told in men's stories, that may or may not be told in perpetrator documents. They're useful because they're stories, I suppose, that disrupt the smooth telling of the past in dominant narratives, which sometimes feature an uncritical sort of assignment of roles like hero or victim or villain, right? Disruption is not always a bad thing. And women's stories across episodes of war and genocide form a historical thread that highlights commonalities of experience and vulnerability and resistance. It isn't just this conflict or this genocide or this war. This is a larger story, and there are a lot of commonalities to women's experiences. This constitutes its own history of war and genocide. It's of course appropriate to recognize and reject the stigmatization of women victimized by sexual violence. It's time to stigmatize the perpetrators rather than the victims. And finally, and again, not to oversell the idea of heroism, which is sort of a complicated term, certainly in thinking about a genocide and thinking about the Holocaust, but women are not only victims. Women also protect and take risks and are innovative and have courage. So our idea of heroism, especially in war, right, is very narrow, and I think perhaps women's testimonies give us an opportunity to expand that a little bit, to move away from just the sort of manly or unmanly or manful idea of thinking about what is or is not heroic. And did I keep to my time? You know, I have 1 minute? I'm done. I'll give my 1 minute to Marta. Thank you.